Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you today, but sadly, I'm unable to be in Vilnius in person. It is a great city, and I was fortunate enough to visit multiple times when I was a kid. So this will be through recording, but I do hope to have the opportunity to take your questions live at the end. For quick introductions, my name is Sergei Savchenko. I'm from Kharkiv, Ukraine originally, even though I lived most of my life in Canada. So my background is very technical. I studied computer science and I worked at 3DO. They were the creators of one of the first CD-based game consoles that at the time competed with PlayStation 1. And after that, I worked at Electronic Arts, Warner, and more recently Bethesda. So I developed for consoles, handhelds, and mobiles, and in a variety of different game genres, pretty much everything from sports to shooters and RPGs. So the topic of my talk is perhaps unusual for a technical person, but before explaining why, let me start with a card trick. So here we go. There are 6 cards out there. When I turn them over, please pick and remember just one card. Are you ready? All right, let's go. All right, all good? Now, I will try to guess your card and remove it from the set. Ready? All right. So do you see your card? Well, I hope not. So you might have seen this trick before, and no, in this case, it is hard to predict which card will be selected. But what you can do is to replace them all, and hoping that no one will notice. So what is hard for the player is to recognize that the entire set changed, since the attention was focused on the selection and remembering of just a single card, and essentially ignoring everything else, which sort of looks very similar. This is called inattentional blindness, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later. So what does it have to do with game development? Well, we develop interactive entertainment for humans, and humans have very real limits to how they process and how they perceive the information. And beside that, human may not even be motivated enough to process it in the first place. So a lot of incredible creative work can be going to waste if these limits are not respected. So as a technical person, I would rather attempt to understand how it all works under the hood. So here we go, this talk about human attention, visual perception, and motivation. All right. Attention is a behavior process permitting to concentrate only on a discrete part of information. And the reason we need it is because our working memory, where most cognitive processes are happening, is in fact very, very limited. For instance, we can only hold in our memory on average 7 pieces of information at the same time. For instance, something like 7 random digits. And we do have neural pathways supporting several types of processing. Specifically, we have circuits for visual spatial information, phonological information, and kind of episodic sequences. What we cannot do well is multitask, though. So we cannot do several visual tasks at the same time, or we cannot do several phonological tasks at the same time. We have somewhat of a limited ability to do one spatial task and one phonological task. For instance, we can be driving and talking at the same time. But the thing is, these still share common resources. So if you're driving and talking, one primarily spatial task, another one is primarily phonological task, whenever you arrive somewhere unfamiliar or some difficult situation, you will likely stop talking. And the reason is the spatial task became harder and took over shared resources, starving the phonological loop. So We already saw inattentional blindness with the card trick. It is also often demonstrated using what is known as a gorilla experiment. You may have seen it also. So in this experiment, participants are asked to count how many times basketball is passed. The participants start counting and completely miss someone in a gorilla suit just casually walking into the middle of the scene. And it's a fairly large percentage, well over 50% of all participants will notice this gorilla. So one may ask how many features that we develop are kind of gorillas. And sadly, I bet that every game will have a few, especially those appearing early in the game. So in general, using motion to draw player attention is an effective technique. But too much motion, for instance, where we have as few as maybe 2 shapes moving indefinitely above 3 shapes, will be triggering an attentional blindness phenomenon, at least for some of those. And kind of one additional thought here. If you watch this gorilla video, if you can keep watching it over and over, eventually you will notice the gorilla. And that is kind of a little bit what is happening with game devs playing their own game over and over. You start feeling that the game doesn't have enough, that it is too easy, and more often than not, it is not the case, right? So testing on people who are unfamiliar with the new experience and observing their reaction oftentimes is the key. Now, we said that one can remember around 7 digits. So, but is it difficult to remember this sequence of numbers in red? Well, not really, right? If you recognize that they're ordered, it will be just a single piece of information rather than 9 pieces of information. Now, that reduces the load on working memory. So this is called chunking, and essentially we're using our long-term memory to find common semantic meaning for several items and then to manipulate these as one. So affordances, they kind of offer a very similar cognitive effect. So shapes or concepts with well-known function or meaning reduce load on working memory. So for instance, a bridge has a known function and it affords basically users to walk over it, right? And it requires less attention to perceive what it is because we kind of know intuitively what it is for. Now, a bit of a significant design issue oftentimes is unaffording affordances. So for instance, if we put a collision in the middle of this bridge, or for instance, we have doors that cannot open, or we have some weapons that player can pick and some other weapons that are purely decorative, that is not awesome because it creates this dissonance between what players know intuitively and what they can act upon in a game. All right, one other quick note here is that it is important to remember that our longer-term memory and actually the memorization process is fairly fragile. So for instance, we can only remember at 60% after just 20 minutes. And that drops, by the end of the day, that drops to just 30%. So what is being learned recently usually doesn't create a good affordance. It's only usually kind of the long-term held concepts that you've known for a long time that can serve as such. All right, there's this great book by Dr. Celia Hodent, and it speaks in much more detail about how the brain works and the implications that it has on a good UX design. So this is highly recommended. All right, so let's suppose that the player is paying full attention, observing the scene, and the question is, would we not be able to sense the world accurately? So, well, the thing is, while our visual sensors are effective in everyday terms, they also are quite peculiar. So for instance, what we think are horizontal lines, or what we observe as a curved and inclined lines, may in fact be just purely horizontal. So this is called the cafe wall illusion, and that's what is happening here. Perfectly horizontal lines appear curved. It's fairly easy to verify that that's in fact the case. Now, this is called a Craig O'Brien chord suite illusion, and by most people, well, practically by everybody, it is perceived as a checkerboard. But the thing is, it is not a checkerboard. So if you only cover the edges, you can see that the kind of lightness inside every cell is in fact the same. All right, so this is called the scintillating grid, and in it, you probably can see in kind of mid-periphery that there's those dark smudges appearing in the middle of white circles. So the thing is, it's a purely static image, and you can demonstrate it by just covering half of those circles away. Now, this is called the watercolor illusion, and what we usually observe is that inside of this highly irregular shape, it appears yellowish, right? But not the case. Both inside and outside of the shape is pure white. However, it's interesting that we perceive fairly large area as something that it's not. You probably have seen this one. This is called, that's kind of an illustration, what's known as peripheral drift illusion. And we can see a lot of motion in it. Again, probably not in your central vision, kind of mid-periphery vision. So also not the case, that's a purely static image. All right, so while effective, once again, is kind of in everyday sense, human vision is definitely not accurate. So this has multiple different implications for computer graphics and for game development in general. So for instance, simulating visual reality has perceptual limits. So it's kind of important for game developers to understand how vision works. And of course, if you're working in VR or AR, that's doubly so for obvious reasons, because these generally use our sensors much more intimately. All right, so let's start with the sensors, our eyes. So our eyes have a two-lens system. There's cornea, which is of a fixed curvature, and there's a lens behind it, which is of adjustable curvature. And the scene in front of us is projected and kind of inverted onto the retina, which is the back of our eyes. And it kind of is primarily focused in what's known as the foveal pit, which is a small depression. And this depression has the highest concentration of cone receptors. It doesn't have rod receptors in there. And rod receptors are there for night vision or for kind of low light intensity vision, while the cone receptors, we have them for day vision, for color vision, for day vision. And another interesting thing is that where the optical nerve leaves the retina, essentially in that spot, we're functionally blind. And we're psychologically unaware of that. Even if you're looking at the scene with a single eye, basically higher levels of the vision system would fill in that spot with what could be there. But it's actually not what is actually there. So vision is highly non-uniform. We have extremely high acuity kind of in a central vision area, that like what is being projected onto the fovea, but that only covers around 2 degrees of our central vision. And for instance, if you extend your arms and focus on the 2 thumbs, then if there's like some text next to your fingers, you would quickly realize that it would appear, if you're not shifting your gaze, this text would appear highly blurred. So outside of those 2 degrees of central vision, the acuity of vision basically drops 50%, and it drops to just 30% at 4 degrees. So we have very good kind of awareness of the surrounding, and we generally don't feel any discomfort from this fairly low acuity vision outside of few central degrees. And by the way, color vision also declines a little bit the further you go in the periphery. And you probably know that VR games routinely take advantage of this by implementing what's known as foveal LOD. And what it does is essentially presents the highest LOD just in the middle of the screen where likely the player is looking and what is going to be mapped to the foveals. So to sense visual features, retinal receptors are organized into receptive fields. And essentially they act as differential filters. So they have this center surround organization and they produce a response that subtracts the single signal in the center from the signal in the surround. So the center is connected through what's known as bipolar cell to the ganglion cell, and ganglion cell essentially they send the projections through the optical nerve into the brain. And surround receptors in the surround, they're meshed together using a horizontal cell, which kind of sums up, or depending on the situation, sometimes it averages the response of those cells. So if the center is excited, the cell would produce a very vigorous response. So this is in figure number 2. And this is different from basically when neither surround or center is illuminated, because in that default situation, the cell just produces this kind of periodic response every once in a while. And when the center gets illuminated, the cell kind of, the activity goes up and it produces a very rapid kind of succession of firing. Basically, the potential would increase rapidly and then drop, and it would be happening quite frequently. So if the opposite is happening and the surround is eliminated, then basically the intensity of the response of the cell drops. It just responds very rarely, just every once in a while. And again, because it acts as sort of a differential filter, if the entire cell is illuminated, then it produces pretty much the same response as if nothing is illuminated at all. So as you can see, this is well suited to sense discontinuities. And well, there are many different types of ganglion cells and corresponding receptive fields. And among those, there are 2 major kinds that probably take combined 95% of all RGCs. So they're midget or so-called parvo cells, and they produce sustained, fairly long response when activated by sensing discontinuities, as we just spoke about. And the other kind, what's known as parasol or magno cells, they have just a brief response, also whenever it feels like senses discontinuity, but it basically sustains for a fairly short period of time. So midget system is thought to basically be there for edge detection, and the parasol system is for kind of motion detection or change detection at a fairly large scale. And parasol, basically, those cells can be quite large. They cover a lot of retina, especially in vision periphery. So ganglion cells, they send signals to their corresponding neurons in what's known as LGN, lateral geniculate nucleus, and there basically those signals, they get recombined and sent further into the basically visual cortex at the back of our heads. And so the retinal ganglion cells, they have mostly one-to-one association with neurons in LGN, but that organization becomes quite a bit more complex when it goes into cortex, into the area called striatum or V1. And so generally, those cells are kind of combined into what's known as simple cells, and those ones are essentially there to sense kind of short edges or sometimes moving edges. And in the striate, basically projections are organized in kind of those columns, And that's where basically response from both eyes become fairly close to one another. That supports binocular vision. But also those columns are organized in also kind of swirls, and neighboring cells in there are responsible for slightly different orientation of edges. And interestingly, we have more receptors, more simple cells responsible for strictly vertical or strictly horizontal orientations. And the thinking is that this is probably because it reflects how our vision is getting trained by the environment. Because in our environments, even in natural environments, there's kind of predominance of vertical and horizontal edges. For instance, trees and horizon lines, they're all either vertical or horizontal. So obviously the way this works have implication on what we can easily see and what we cannot see so well. So for instance, here, if you look at those strips inside those kind of white ovals, you probably, depending on the resolution that you're getting on your screen, you can probably see the stripes, but it's probably not that easy to say what's the color. So it looks kind of grayish in both cases. But what those two charts are, those are sine curves of equiluminous red-green and blue-yellow. And this chart basically, they help us to understand our sensitivity to contrast. So the frequency of lines, it kind of increases left to right, and then the contrast is decreasing from top to bottom. And so indeed sometimes we cannot quite recognize the color stimuli in something like that. And it's also easy to see differences between chromatic and achromatic contrast perception. So low frequency chromatic, like for instance in that oval, like a larger oval on the left, you can probably see that there's a bit of green and a bit of red. But if you look at the big oval on the right, where essentially it's grayscale, achromatic, it probably feels just basically flat, right? On the other hand, in the smaller ovals on top, on the left, it's a little bit hard to tell what colors they are, and the stripes look fairly faint, but on the right, they look very prominent. So basically, at high frequencies, we have much better achromatic perception, but on low frequencies, we actually can tell color much better. So to quickly summarize a couple of points on vision, so we cannot quite really see greenish reds or yellowish blues. And the reason for that is that the way data is transmitted to the brain, it combines the information for those color pairs. And green shades in general, they require smaller wavelength change to perceive as distinct. And red and blue are more problematic as small foreground elements. Longer discussion why, it's a topic in itself. So not everyone sees the same way, right? There are colorblind people, and a lot, about 1 out of 10. And even with kind of people with what's known as normal vision, we do not really perceive pure colors at the same wavelength. So it's similar enough, but it's not the same. So we also very likely sending more information to brain about edges than about colors. And that's why many compression schemes for images, they dedicate less bits for colors. And of course, we send much more information for central vision compared to periphery. So all of that combined have a lot of implications for UX designers and for artists. Now, so since our detailed vision is so narrow, we need to constantly shift gaze. So to do that, we perform saccadic eye movement that take about 30-40 milliseconds. And those movements are followed usually by fixation period, which lasts about 200-300 milliseconds. So during the fixation, microsaccades are constantly performed to make sure that color receptors that don't oversaturate. And interestingly, that when we're shifting gaze during the saccade itself, we're essentially functionally blind. And it's quite easy to verify that that's the case. If you look into the mirror, you can never see your own eyes in movement. And of course, we're psychologically unaware of this, what's known as transsaccadic suppression. And the interesting thing is that we have very limited memory from before to after the saccade. And of course, if we only knew when the gaze is getting shifted, we can use that and shift LODs quite painlessly during this period. So maybe in the future, when we have better cameras looking at the player, that'll be easy to do. So one other thing about the fixation destinations, so these usually go toward basically interesting kind of features in the scene, and interesting, that means something that's either a face or something with a high density of edges. And for approaching humans, usually what we will do, we will first look, determine where the face is, and then we'll shift the gaze to the feet, and that is being done just to judge basically the distance. And fixation points themselves are kind of task dependent, as shown as this foundational work by Alfred Yerbus back from the 60s. And one important thing to think about is just how much of that scene is never being looked at in detail. So, and it's a lot. Well, so in general, the goal of the vision system is to recognize object positions, properties of the material, no matter what's the lighting situation. And of course, we have some biases that are due to the way basically our vision system has been trained. So for instance, when you look at this, probably the outer ring, those kind of spheres in the outer ring, they look as if they're sticking out. And if you only turn it 180 degrees, that perception changes, and the sphere in the middle appears as if it's sticking out a little bit. And the reason for that is generally our vision system has this bias to consider lighting kind of, that lighting is done from above. And it's not an absolute bias, and in the presence of other clues like contact shadows, this perception just quickly fades away. Like for instance, in this image, there are contact shadows and the lighting from the bottom, but it's easy to understand that it's not ambiguous at all. There's a bit of also lighting from the left bias that we have, probably because in the childhood, most of us had this lighting situation for right-handed people where the light was kind of on your left. Now, there's other peculiar things about our recognition of shapes and faces. For instance, we have a dedicated brain area responsible for face recognition. It's called fusiform face area, FFA. And we generally recognize faces and shift the gaze toward faces, even in our peripheral vision. But what is interesting is that it's not invariant to orientation. Like for instance, we look at that, it looks a little bit strange, but not offensive as an image. We recognize who that is. But if we only turn it to normal orientation, wow, the image on the left doesn't look normal at all. So basically, we recognize faces better in traditional, like just in a normal orientation. So shadows are incredibly important for our visual perception, and they give a very strong positional clues. So for instance, those clues are generally stronger than kind of perspective clues of the size, relative size of different objects. So for instance, we interpret the middle sphere to be hovering on the image on top, and just by manipulating the shadows, even though the correct kind of perspective clue tells us that it should be further. But again, the shadow is a stronger clue. And we generally do not perceive shadows as shapes, and probably the main reason why is because of the softness of the edge. So this is a natural image. If we only kind of take a Sharpie and draw the sort of around the shadow, it doesn't look as much of a shadow anymore, right? So, and of course, the softness of the edge is there for optical reasons, is because most of practical light sources, they're not point lights there, they have some area. And also, lights usually, the intensity of shadow is usually not the same. It is darker toward the object and lighter the further it goes away from the object. But at the same time, not everything about shadows is equally important for us perceptually. So for instance, looking at that image, probably nothing jumps at you as being out of place. Like there's some shadows, they kind of look okay. But the thing is, there's at least one that is inaccurate, and we generally would not recognize it. Normally, we would tolerate fairly large discrepancies in the shadow directions and actually shadow length without noticing. So shadow shape and length beyond the contact may be less meaningful for us perceptually. So another thing, collectively, over the course of last 10, 15 years, game industry has spent a lot of efforts addressing global illumination. And the thing is, things definitely do look better when global illumination is done right. But at the same time, not all elements of global illumination may be equally important to our perception. So the current thinking is that our visual system splits the scene in its projection into areas where illumination is perceived mostly constant or just smoothly changing. So there's some evidence that our vision system is more sensitive to low terms of irradiance, so just ambient and broad directional. And things like contact shadows, ambient occlusion, specular highlight, they're definitely meaningful perceptually, but at the same time, length of shadows may not be as important. So as we just discussed, shadow directions and illumination direction permit fairly large discrepancies without viewers paying much attention to it. So some interactions like color bleeding, they may jump at you, they could be salient when they're overdone, but not meaningful enough perceptually when they're actually done at proper intensity. And also everybody knows that you can apply a highly inaccurate high-frequency environment map to something that is highly curved without anybody noticing that. Let's check this video. Yeah, that's quite a bit of difference. And if you were only trying to seek something unusual in there and kind of were spending time visually accounting the scene, you may not have noticed those changes at all. So it's important to recognize that sometimes we won't perceive any motion, even though there is some. And so that video was exactly 1 minute. So is it long enough? But basically, it's long enough for us to stop noticing the change. But at the same time, as we saw earlier, sometimes what is perfectly static is being perceived by us as moving. For instance, like this peripheral drift illusion. So important aspect of motion perception is that circuits reacting to moving edges may also react to color gradients. And because it kind of results in the same effect, same accumulation of photons falling onto the receptors. So here, that's a bit of an explanation for peripheral drift illusion. If you look at that star, on your left, then in your peripheral vision you might feel that those circles kind of they're rotating, right? And the rotation generally goes from dark to light. All right, so a bit of a challenge for you. What is this thing? All right, so remember your guess, and here we go. So that must be easier to understand what it is. So this is biological movement. Obviously, we have a fairly kind of ingrained ability in our vision system to recognize biological movement. But even though we have a dedicated area for it, a similar thing occurs as to face recognition. So basically, we recognize movement, biological movement, better in the just regular orientation, and when it's a strange orientation, we don't perceive it as much. So there's a particular area in the brain, STS, where generally neurons responsible for biological movement, where they're concentrated. Interestingly enough, that same area responsible for like other related things, or maybe it's the FFA area that is also responsible for recognition of car shapes for those who are into cars. All right, so frame rate. That's one important area to talk about, and I'm sure this is something that occurs during development process quite a few times. So does our game need to be at 60 FPS? If we draw more at 30 FPS, does it feel better overall, and so on? So we do know that different parts of our vision system have fairly different kind of temporal parameters, how those things operate. So for instance, the midget system is fairly slow, but it produces sustained response, and the parasol system that is fast, but it doesn't produce a sustained response. The response is very quick. And there are other networks responsible for like gaze shift, pupillary reflex, color constancy, and they all have their own different parameters. So the question is, what is the best frame rate to render motion at? And it is not an easy one to answer, but there are a couple of important points. So we know that depending on the intensity of kind of the illumination that the retina receives and the size of the changing stimuli, at some frame rate, the images fuse, and we do not perceive change as flicker anymore. We just perceive it as constant illumination. So this is called a flicker fusion threshold. And we know that for bright objects and for large moving stimuli, basically flicker fusion occurs at high frame rate. But generally, this is usually below 60 FPS. But it, of course, depends on the type of technology that is used. So, for instance, LED backlight, it dims to just about 10-20% when it's off, which was not the case with old CRTs that had a lot of like lighting inertia to them. And we do need to pay attention also to the fact that while sometimes we cannot see flicker, we can still feel it, sometimes like at as high as 300 hertz. So this graph over there, it plots curves for objects of different size versus retinal illumination, so versus the frame rate. So basically, large objects at high illumination require faster frame rate, and when you can get away with as low as 10 FPS for something that is small or fairly dark. And another important thing is that our central vision is generally less sensitive to flicker than our near periphery. It's because different kind of receptive fields are they're asymmetric. There's more midget cells in the kind of central vision and more kind of larger parasol cells that are parasol receptive fields that are in the periphery. All right, so this is a great reference, probably the best there is, and it speaks to much more and to much deeper level of detail. All right, so while someone can be paying attention and the visual system could be doing a pretty good job, there's always an additional question. So does the player care to follow what's going on in the first place? So hence this question of player motivation. So there's no single theory of human motivation, but there's like a bunch of different theories about it. Here's just a very quick overview. Now you have probably seen this one. So this is Maslow's pyramids of need, and probably not the most modern view of human motivation, but it is reflective of prioritization of different needs that we experience depending on the situation. So for instance, it is hard to work on self-actualization if one is hungry or if there's bombs falling. So ERG theory, standing for existence, relatedness, and growth. So this is from back from 60s. It outlines somewhat different arrangement of basic needs. So in this theory, humans are sort of assumed to fluctuate between existence and relatedness needs, and then between the growth and relatedness needs, depending on the situation. So even earlier theory of needs outlined three main areas for power, achievement, and for affiliation. And indeed, there is some fairly modern research that contrasts some game players specifically into groups, those seeking power and control versus those seeking achievement. All right, and finally, SDT, or self-determination theory, that's perhaps the most modern one, and it's used the most to model player engagement and retention. So you probably have heard of PENS, which is player engagement need satisfaction model, and essentially is based on self-determination theory. So the theory postulates that we have intrinsic needs for achievement competence, seeking autonomy, and seeking relations to others. And basically longer-term engagement in games, they kind of require those three things being satisfied. And then extrinsic regulation can also be quite effective. So for instance, reward punishment and introjection, basically the approval of others, those can be fairly effective, but generally they act kind of on a shorter term. So more autonomous extrinsic regulators, like for instance, identification, so that works more like intrinsic needs. So things like brand loyalty, etc., that belongs into this domain. So what does it mean for some of the needs and regulation in practical terms for games that we build? So the following element generally drives the engagement. So competency and meaning making for player, that usually requires clarity of goals, feedback on how the player is doing, basically resolving unknowns, including narrative unknowns, flow in general, so we'll talk about it just a little bit later. And then autonomy needs, they're expressed through gameplay choices or illusion of choices. And then openness of the overall experience, ability to customize, also that falls into this category. And then related needs, those are expressed through kind of this competition behavior, this shifting pattern of cooperating and competing. And that kind of goes hand in hand with social comparison, basically comparing yourself to others. And then rewards, types and timing of rewards, that's of course something that one needs to be very careful with, because basically controlling external regulation, that may lead to a bit of undesirable player position to being controlled. And then introjection, that effect of influences, of friends. And then finally, players do identify with the characters, they identify with game brands, and they identify with company brands. And this is often the key to kind of ongoing success of game franchises. So we mentioned flow, you probably heard of it. So flow in positive psychology, it's basically this mental state of immersed, efficient operation. And then top gameplay experiences, they definitely sort of become flow-like. And generally, that requires this careful balance between level of meaningful challenge and players' ability to overcome it versus kind of familiarity with the context and kind of level of boredom. All right, so this theory of flow was outlined in this foundational book. If you haven't read it, it's definitely highly recommended. So finally, one additional point to make is that, of course, there's this ongoing debate about differences in kind of Asian and Western consumer. For instance, what's the difference between JRPGs and Western RPGs? And there are cultural factors underlining some of the kind of motivational needs for players, and they indeed somewhat different culturally. So to put a bit of scientific base to this debate, it is definitely worth considering cultural dimension theory that was pioneered by Hofstede, who was the Dutch researcher working for IBM. And then the theory introduces 6 different dimensions of how different cultures are different. So those are not individual differences; those are kind of cultural differences. And things like power distance, individualism, uncertainty avoidance, indulgence, etc. It's actually very instructive to take a look how different cultures are different. And as a homework exercise, check how Northern Europe countries are different from Switzerland. That's an interesting one. So certainly some player preferences, say in Western RPGs, let's say choice of a lone wolf character, as opposed to more of a cast of somewhat predefined characters in JRPGs that often kind of act as an implicit group, that can be explained in differences of the cultural dimensions. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here and for listening. I hope that it was at least somewhat useful. And of course, thank you so much to the organizers and for all of their work and the opportunity to present. And thank you also for supporting game devs and other humans who are suffering from the war in Ukraine, and also those affected by political repression in Russia and Belarus. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I guess Sergei has heard all the applause from the crowd here. Thank you very much, Sergei, for this. Wow, we've got like 2 lectures for the price of 1. We've got some cognitive biases and psychology dive. We got anatomy dissection of the eye and stuff like that. So it was really curious. And I hope you guys got some questions piled up already, because we have a mic stand there, and Sergei is waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. Okay, I guess it's my turn then. I don't hear Sergei. Can we do something with this? Okay, now I do hear. Hi, Sergei.
All right. Hi, how are you guys doing? Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you live instead of through recording. So please, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, let's start with the motivations, because it's a topic which is quite popular in the between game designers, and we do know there are many motivational theories and stuff like that, and there are also frameworks like you mentioned SDT Pens by Dr. Ryan. And do you have an opinion which motivational framework works best nowadays?
It's not an easy to answer, because indeed there's no unified theory of human motivation, and obviously it's a kind of complex topic with different aspects. Like, I think it's important to kind of understand the basics and learn multiple different ones and apply them to the specific situation. But generally, I think SDT and PENS is what most people are relying on these days. But other than that, I think there are bits and pieces from other things that are also useful. But as you mentioned, it's a very popular topic. People have a lot of opinions to that. It has to do with a lot of humans with different interests, with different backgrounds. I don't think there's like a single unified approach here. It needs to be measured based on a specific situation and a specific game.
Thank you. It looks like we have a question. Yes, please.
One, two. Hello, my name is Alex, and I have a question about the ethical use of this knowledge. The more we know about psychology, about perception, the more opportunities we get into manipulating people and getting them into like making worst outcomes, like not in their favor, put it that way. How do you draw the line where the ethical starts and like bad practices? Thanks.
Well, I think it has to do, as with anything in life, it has to do with the choices of individual developers, right? I think probably, is it easy really to manipulate people in real life? Well, not that easy. Obviously, there are some people that are better at that, and the same goes for game developers. But ultimately, it does come down to individual choices. What I would say, though, that probably it is somewhat exaggerated, the power of this knowledge. It's really difficult to manipulate somebody, and people have fairly strong responses, like psychological reactants to situations where they feel they're getting controlled. So two things, I guess. One thing, I think there's a bit of an exaggeration how powerful this knowledge is. Secondly, as with anything in life, it comes down to values of individual developers. So certainly some highly basically exploitive mechanics, if those are being overused, it comes with a lot of territory, including negative PR and stuff like that. So all in all, comes down to individual choices of developers. But again, I would not exaggerate that it's that easy to do. It's probably way more complex than people think.
Okay, thank you for this question. Do we have anything else? Okay, I have another one. You mentioned Hofstede's dimensions, about the cultural differences, and back in the days when he came up with this methodology, it was like a black and white. And people often, like scientists, they often challenge this particular approach. And nowadays, the diversity is a very sensitive topic, and especially when we want to, make something culturally different for the game, for this audience in particular. We can take a game and we can make an Asian character, for example. And there's a thin line between, making it diverse and appropriate this particular culture thing. What do you think about it, since you mentioned?
Mm-hmm. Well, so cultural dimensions, again, they're cultural. They're not really about individual differences. And I mean, what is the culture? I would not necessarily equate a culture to kind of geographic national boundaries, right? Like if you think about it, is there really a single culture within a given country or a given population? To your point, right? Like it's getting stratified between people with different interests, with different backgrounds, and different things. So there's it's not very easy to pinpoint what those things are. And again, they're like highly statistical. It's this slight predominance, for instance, people in the West of being more individualistic compared to people in the East. But are there highly individualistic people in the East? Yes, of course. And same thing goes the other way. Now, cultural appropriation, I think again, people, you have to be extremely accurate and understand this culture if you want to use it in some ways other than just a superficial portrayal of something. And you're running a risk that it'll be negatively received by people who understand it much better than you do. So certainly not something to be taken lightly, but I would say there is some degree of oversensitivity to this topic as well. And probably, I don't want to come across as somebody who's not sensitive to that. That's not the case at all. But obviously, if you don't know a given culture, it's very dangerous to try to make significant artistic or verbal statement about it, because most likely you're not going to be accurate, and that's probably the highest risk that we're running. But I would certainly encourage everybody, if you try to kind of display this in games, this kind of cultural diversity, to certainly start with learning and understanding very well what those cultures stand for, what they mean. And it's very difficult, sometimes take decades to be comfortable with making those kind of statements, and that's probably the most important thing. That's my take.
Thank you very much, Sergei. Do we have anything else? Okay then, дякуємо.